Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down the essential, absolute nuts and bolts of how diverse democracies don't just survive, but actually thrive. I mean, have you ever wondered why some countries with deep ethnic or linguistic divides manage to live together in total peace, while others literally tear themselves apart? Well, today we are looking at the very blueprint of peaceful governance. We're going to see how the way a nation chooses to share its power is pretty much the defining factor between harmony and total collapse.
So let's dive right into this fundamental question by looking at two countries. And what's wild is that both of these nations faced incredibly similar challenges in the mid-20th century, but they chose radically different paths. And, this isn't just dusty history. This is about the structural choices that define the day-to-day reality of millions of citizens. How exactly do you govern a population that speaks different languages, worships differently, and has entirely different cultural backgrounds all stuck within the exact same borders?
Here is our roadmap for the explainer today. First, a tale of two countries. Second, the consequences of control. Third, why power sharing matters. And finally, 4 ways to share power. Kicking things off with part 1, a tale of two countries. Okay, so Belgium presents this absolutely fascinating, totally unique linguistic divide. Picture this, you've got 59% of the population living up in the Flemish region speaking Dutch, while 40% lives down in Wallonia speaking French. Oh, and a tiny 1% speaking German. But here is the crazy twist that made things a powder keg. In the capital city of Brussels, the demographics flip completely. There, 80% speak French and only 20% speak Dutch. To add to all that tension, the minority French speakers historically held almost all the wealth and power, which, as you can guess, the Dutch majority deeply resented. It was basically a perfect recipe for a national standoff. Now, let's contrast that with our second country, Sri Lanka. After gaining independence in 1948, they faced a really similar dynamic, just with different numbers. Here you have a very clear, dominant majority. 74% of the population are Sinhala speakers, who are mostly Buddhist. Coexisting with them is a significant 18% Tamil minority, made up of Hindus and Muslims. So you've got two distinct groups sharing one island, trying to figure out how to build a brand new, independent nation together. Which brings us right into part 2, the consequences of control. So the tipping point in Sri Lanka's story really boils down to this one big concept, majoritarianism. Basically, instead of accommodating the Tamil minority, the newly independent Sinhala leaders decided to establish complete, unchecked dominance over the state. They operated on the belief that simply having the most people meant they could rule the country however they wanted, completely sweeping aside the needs, the culture, and the rights of the minority. Looking at these two, their legal strategies were like night and day. Belgium realized that to survive, they absolutely had to adapt. Between 1970 and 1993, they chose a really complex path of accommodation. They literally amended their constitution 4 separate times, just to create a system where everyone could actually live together. Sri Lanka, on the other hand, legally locked in that majoritarian dominance. In 1956, they passed an act recognizing Sinhala as the sole official language. And they didn't even stop there. They actively started handing out university and government job preferences only to Sinhala applicants. And sadly, Sri Lanka's approach had absolutely devastating consequences. That 1956 Sinhala-only act deeply, deeply alienated the Tamil population. Look, when people feel entirely locked out of their own country's future, tensions are going to boil over. This directly sparked a bloody civil war that lasted for decades. It wasn't until 2009 that the conflict finally ended, but by then it had severely ruined the nation's economy and just tore its social fabric to pieces. On the flip side, Belgium avoided war entirely. How? Well, they basically re-engineered their whole government to make sure no single community could just make decisions on their own. They mandated an equal number of Dutch and French-speaking ministers in the central government. They gave state governments actual real power, so they weren't just taking orders from the center anymore. And, my favorite part, this is brilliant, they invented a totally unique third tier of government called a community government. It's elected strictly by language groups to handle cultural and educational stuff. Just a total masterpiece of political engineering.
Let's move along to part 3, why power sharing matters.
So why go through all this trouble? The why basically comes down to 2 camps. First, you've got prudential reasons. Think of this as the highly calculated, almost mathematical approach to keeping the peace. It acknowledges that sharing power physically reduces the possibility of conflict and ensures long-term stability. It's just good for business, right? On the other side, we have moral reasons. This is the core belief that true democracy fundamentally requires giving a voice to the governed. It says that power sharing isn't just some clever political trick to stop riots, it is literally the spirit of democracy itself.
And finally, part 4, 4 ways to share power. Okay, so here are the 4 actual nuts and bolts ways modern democracies distribute authority out in the real world. You've got horizontal distribution, vertical distribution, sharing among social groups, and sharing among political parties. You know, like the coalition governments that pop up when no single party wins an outright majority. Let's zoom in on those first 2 major ones a bit further to really see how they tick.
Focusing on horizontal distribution, the absolute key here is the concept of checks and balances. Imagine a totally flat playing field where the legislature, the executive, and the judiciary all sit on the exact same level. They're placed horizontally for one specific reason, so they can limit each other's power. The lawmakers, the rule enforcers, and the judges are all literally keeping tabs on one another. No single branch can run away with the state's power because the other 2 are always right there to pull them back. Now, check out the next dimension, vertical distribution. This is where power flows from the top down. A federal system has a general central authority up top, distributing power downward to regional, state, or provincial governments. Remember how Belgium made sure its state governments were no longer subordinate to the center? Yep, that was them perfectly executing this vertical power sharing. It ensures local issues are actually handled locally, while the big national issues stay up top.
Before we wrap up the explainer, I want to leave you with this quote. It really hits the nail on the head regarding the moral imperative behind everything we've looked at today. A democratic rule involves sharing power with those affected by its exercise. It is such a simple yet profound statement, isn't it? If a government's decisions are going to impact your life, you absolutely deserve a share of the power in making those decisions. So now that you know the mechanics of accommodation versus majoritarianism and you've seen the horizontal and vertical architectures of power, I want you to look around. Look at your own government. Look at your local councils. Ask yourself, how are these forces at play right now, today, in your world? Are diverse voices being accommodated like we saw in Belgium, or is there a push for majoritarian control? The blueprint is everywhere once you know how to read it. Thanks so much for joining me to break this down. Keep asking those big questions, and I'll catch you next time.